Okay, so make sure you have your PDF open, right? It comes from your textbook, but I kind of marked mine up a little bit, and so it's a good idea. Yeah, help us out a little bit. We kind of view that one. So I'm on the first page of the reading. And what page is that, you ask? Well, I will tell you, if I can. 445. So on 445, the very first paragraph, he talks about the ends of the two cities, right? So the two cities are the city of God and the city of man. And I point that out because we're kind of like paratrooping in right in the middle of things. Notice we're starting on book 19, right? So a lot has happened in the text that we didn't read first. So the end of the city of God, as we will see, is happiness. And the end of the city of man is also happiness. However, the city of God, the happiness lies in eternal life. That is where we're going ultimately. And for man, the city of man, we're talking about the temporal life. Right? And eternal just means without time. Temporal means in time. Right? And when he says cities, right? Remember, he's writing in Latin, so he means civitas, which is kind of like saying, this is obviously civilization and all that kind of stuff, right? What that means is an ordered society. We can almost think, just like the Greeks, think almost like polis, a governed entity. In chapter 2, same page, he talks about three kinds of life. And we may come back to this like later, but he says of the three kinds, there is the leisurely, but not slothful, devoted to contemplating truth. Okay, there's that one. Then there is the second, the busy life, devoted to human affairs. And a third one, a combination of the two. So let's call it a combo. Now, why is he talking about this? I think it's important to kind of check this out. So leisure, in Latin, is schola, which is where we get the word school and scholastic and everything. And so the idea in Latin is that leisure has a lot to do with, has a lot to do with, oh my gosh, my little thing is going crazy, with education. However, remember, I think at the beginning of the course, we talked about how education, right, the ducat means to be led, a leader, a leading. We're really talking about enlightenment. So, in other words, when he's talking about the leisurely life, going to school is a leisurely thing. At least it used to be. When we now start to tie school to our jobs, and you know how at the end of the day, pretty much we're all in college for careers, right? And I mean, to a certain extent, that's always been the case. But at the same time, we're also interested in enlightening ourselves, right? So that on our pursuit of careers, I didn't mean to cut through that. We also are going to understand literature, philosophy, languages, history, that kind of stuff, so that we can be members of a civitas. In other words, an ordered society. Because we can't really vote properly. We can't really maintain our freedoms and liberties if we're not enlightened. Anyway, so the leisurely life is, think about the life of someone who gets to contemplate all day. And I think here he's talking about philosophers and also priests, bishops, that kind of stuff. Right? Because these are people, I'm not saying they're lazy, not at all, but their main function is to contemplate truth, right? And I think that most of us are probably down here in the busy world of human affairs, right? This is the world of our jobs and families and bills, right? And then there's something in between. And that's a little bit of both, right? But notice what he says. He says, when anyone attains the final good, he is forthwith made happy. However, the life devoted to learned leisure, to public business, or to performing both does not necessarily make one happy. Certainly there are many able to live in one or another of these ways, but err with respecting to the final good, by which man is happy. Essentially what he's arguing here is that the leisurely has the time to contemplate truth, the busy doesn't, and the combo ends up kind of doing both, half, so not all that good. As we're going to see later on, his point in all of this is that we need to pay attention to the leisurely. Okay. Why is there pieces of paper missing here? I'm moving to 46. So in 46, this is chapter 4, right? He starts talking about different final goods. And you'll notice there's a quote there, chapter 4, where he says, the just man lives by faith, for we do not at present see our good, and thus must seek it through believing. Nor does our living rightly derive from ourselves, except as far as he who gives the very faith through which we believe ourselves to be in need of help from him helps us in our believing and praying. So he's laying it on here pretty thick for a just person needs faith in God, right? And notice what he's also saying is not only do we need God, but we need to know we need God to ask God for help to know God, right? He continues, those, however, have held the final good and evil in this life, whether they place the supreme good in the body, the soul, or both, and indeed to express it more explicitly, whether they place it in pleasure or in virtue or both, which, by the way, when he's talking about pleasure, he means more than likely a guy by the name of Epicurus, an ancient Greek guy. And when he's talking about virtue, he's talking about Aristotle. So he says, people have these different versions of what happiness is, right? And here's a few of them, as he suggests. But whether in primary things of the nature, virtue, etc., they wanted to be happy here and now through an astonishing vanity. They wanted to be made happy by their own actions. The truth ridiculed them through the prophet, saying, the Lord knows the thoughts of men. Or as the Apostle Paul puts it, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, and they are in vain. In other words, what is our buddy Augustine saying? Essentially, he is advocating that philosophers, and that's the symbol for philosophy, are all wrong. Don't follow the philosophers, because they will not get you happiness, because to them, happiness is on earth. And his point here is that the city of God, the whole shtick, is that happiness is in an eternal life. So don't listen to the philosophers. And then he goes through in the next couple of pages talking about goods. Are goods in the mind itself? For instance, on that one paragraph still on page 446. Is it in the mind themselves? His point here is that, well, if we're going to follow Aristotle, because remember how Aristotle made such a big deal about reason? So if we're going to follow Aristotle and we're going to say that the human mind is the source of our ultimate happiness and our ultimate good, what about if you lose your mind? Notice on the bottom of the page, he starts talking about demons, right? Now, don't fault these guys for talking about demons. By demons, what he means is, check this out. You probably, there are people who eat other people. There are people who murder children. Just think about, Columbine came to mind, or Sandy Hook, where people walk into a school and kill toddlers. What in the hell is the matter with that? Like, how can you even wrap your mind around what would possess someone to do that? Modern psychology doesn't. We have terms. We can say they're sociopaths, they're psychopaths, whatever, right? And for some strange reason, our culture really likes hearing stories about these people and watching their lives on TV, which you gotta wonder. But at the end of the day, we still don't know, nor can we predict. We think we understand what makes these people tick because people with PhDs tell us, well, they are this label, they are a sociopath. And if you look at their lives, this happened, that happened, that happened, so bam. But at the end of the day, you still cannot decide, or you still cannot say, if person A experiences the same trauma as person B, why is person B eating people, but person A is not, right? My point here is, when in the past they didn't understand how things work, they would often resort to magic. They'd talk about things like demons, right? So you'd say, hey, that guy is eating children, and we don't understand what motivates him to eat children, so we're going to call it a demon. In the same way, I would say, before we cast aspersions then on Augustine, here's my point. We need to keep in mind, do we know how our cell phones work? Right? How many of us know backward and forward how our phones work so that if they break, we can take it apart and fix it, right? Or how many of us know how our cars actually work, right? From the time you turn the key or push the button, do you know exactly every step in the way? Like, if you went back in time to the medieval period, could you make a car? If you had all the stuff, right? So anyway, my point. We often start rolling our eyes when people talk about things like demons. But keep in mind, there's a lot we don't know that might as well be magic. I mean, at the end of the day, our phones might as well be magic to us, right? So anyway, the point that he's trying to make is, if we're going to say that the ultimate end of human happiness is the human mind, what happens when that mind is sick, right? What happened when that mind starts to fall apart? And so on 447, the top paragraph there, he says, the corruptible body weighs down the soul, and the earthly dwelling oppresses the intelligence as it considers many things. An impulse, an appetite for action, if in this way Latin rightly means that what the Greeks call horme, is accounted as the primary good of nature. Yet is it not precisely this which also produces the miserable motions and deeds of the insane, blah, blah, blah. In other words, if we're going to talk about the mind, right, as our primary function, but doesn't the body affect the mind? Doesn't the body make the mind sometimes, lose our mind, right? So, in other words, what he's saying is, this whole philosophical thing about putting human happiness in the mind, in virtue, in anything other than God, is to set us up for failure because we'll always miss the mark. And so, furthermore there, in the one paragraph that begins, further, virtue itself, which is not among the primary goods of nature, on page 447, his point here is that he's saying the thing about virtues is, so right in the center, the spirit desires an opposition of the flesh. For these, he says, are at war with each other. Okay, so you got the spirit here, right? And the idea is that the spirit wants to do what is good, right? And then you got the flesh here, the body, and the body wants to do what it desires, right? So think back to tripartite soul. It's really not that much different. What he's saying is, but let's, instead of mind, we'll call this spirit, i.e. the spirit which links us to God, right? And then here's our bodies. And the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, right? So in other words, even when we're like, oh yeah, we want to do this, and we want to be good, and we want to go to church, and we want to be honest, and all that kind of stuff, very often our desires sort of pull us down, right? Very often, even if we're up here, we're like, physical desire tends to outweigh, right? We want to have fun, we want to have pleasure on a physical level, etc. Which therefore means that these two are always in conflict with each other. And if we are in conflict within ourselves, right? So if spirit is one thing, body is another, and they want two different things, how can this possibly be happy? There's no way that this could be happy, right? And so then he talks about, on that same page, prudence, justice, courage, and shows how, despite what Aristotle says, none of those virtues will ultimately lead to happiness because we're still at war with ourselves. We have to force ourselves. So therefore, what is the one good virtue? He adds a new virtue on page 448. In the paragraph on the left-hand column where he says, if virtues are true, and true virtues cannot exist except in those who possess true piety. So piety refers to giving way to the spirit. So the pious person is more spiritual, which means they are able to not have so much influence of the body. True virtues are not such liars to profess this. They do, however, profess that human life, which is compelled by the great number and magnitude of evils in this world to be miserable, is happy through hope in a future world. So this hope is the real virtue. And what is hope? It is thinking of a future world. Not the one here and now, right? Not this one that you're in, but rather, as he says, by hope we are made well. However, hope that is seen is not hope, for how can one hope for what one sees? However, if we hope for what we do not see, we look forward to it with patience. Therefore, as we are made well by hope, so we are made happy by hope, and we do not presently possess well-being, but look forward to it in the future with patience, and so this is happiness. So happiness is about looking forward with patience to the future world. Obviously, what he's talking about is heaven. So, in other words, all of this stuff here, all of this conflict, right? If we're truly spiritual, this collapses because we're not interested in the physical stuff of now, because we hope to the future instead of looking at today. And it's that hope for the future thing that will bring us real happiness. So, from chapters 1 to 5, here's what we're seeing. We're seeing that ultimately happiness is about understanding and appreciating the future world, which is heaven. Our actions on this earth, despite what the Greek philosophers say, will never bring us true happiness, because we will always be in conflict unless we can rise above with piety our physical selves.